Ok, allora siamo in realtà un po' in ritardo rispetto alla tabella di marcia, quindi non so se vogliamo, so che c'era una domanda da parte di Alice, non so se vogliamo dare spazio o magari ci prendiamo giusto 5 minuti e poi facciamo 5 minuti di pausa anche perché penso che ce ne sia bisogno. Alice,
Come
quindi
stai,
se vuoi
Alice?
smutarti e fare la domanda direttamente a voce,
Grazie.
poi...
Però non so se c'è ancora, volevo fare una domanda a Paola, sì, forse sì. No, forse ho sbagliato. Chi è che parlava prima di sensorialità, di ricerca sulla sensorialità della necessità? Era Paola?
Sì, sì,
Ok,
eccomi.
allora Paola, ho scritto bene. Mi colpiva l'intento di trovare dei parametri quantitativi al millimetro addirittura, no? Per lavorare, cioè per conoscere meglio tutta la dimensione della sensorialità, che in effetti, insomma, come saprai meglio di me, si inizia a definire più in termini di percezione che di sensorialità, no? Vera e propria. E io mi chiedevo due cose. Intanto, come si fa a oggettivare dei parametri tenendo conto che, dei parametri quantitativi tenendo conto che c'è una grossa fluttuazione di fatto nell'esperienza della propria percezione e, e soprattutto da ignorante lo dico questo, cioè nel nostro confrontarci, nel nostro analizzare la nostra esperienza, metterla a confronto con l'esperienza degli altri, pare emergere sempre di più che le differenze di tipo percettivo siano effettivamente più qualitative che quantitative e quindi mi interessava capire che ne potevi pensare.
Allora, grazie. C'entra un punto fondamentale nella nostra ricerca, che si volge proprio a identificare dei parametri quantitativi nell'ambito di esperimenti, di manipolazioni sperimentali, e fra un attimo dico che cosa intendo per questo, che evidenzino e isolino il processo percettivo, separandolo da quello, per esempio, sensoriale di base, ma anche separandolo dal processo decisionale, che generalmente accompagna l'espressione, la descrizione della percezione. Entrambi questi livelli sono livelli che noi vogliamo tenere costanti, il livello sensoriale e il livello decisionale, e siamo interessati al livello percettivo. Per poterlo isolare c'è una lunghissima storia di psicologia sperimentale e di fisiologia che ha costruito dei paradigmi sperimentali in cui si manipolano le immagini, banalmente si presentano delle immagini su un video, su uno schermo e si confrontano le risposte, ad esempio fisiologiche, a due immagini che sono esattamente pari per contenuto sensoriale, ma sono interpretate differentemente dal punto di vista percettivo. Ed è lì che possono emergere delle differenze nell'interpretazione percettiva che un partecipante ne dà e un altro invece non ne dà. Ci sono, per esempio, giusto per avere un punto di riferimento condiviso, alcune illusioni cosiddette ottiche, in cui vediamo la rotazione, per esempio, di un oggetto che è effettivamente illusoria perché sullo schermo ci sono solo dei pallini che si muovono da sinistra verso destra, eppure noi lo interpretiamo come un oggetto tridimensionale. Dunque, sono le risposte a queste interpretazioni percettive che noi registriamo, per esempio registrando la modulazione nel tempo dei parametri fisiologici. E poi chiudo dicendo che effettivamente c'è un'enorme fluttuazione nel tempo all'interno dello stesso partecipante, e in questo senso cerchiamo di tenere costanti tutte le condizioni che siamo in grado di regolare, e anche tra individui, e alcune di queste fluttuazioni sono effettivamente rumore sperimentale, da qui la nostra difficoltà nel restituire il dato della singola registrazione o del singolo individuo. Non siamo pronti, non siamo a questo stadio in cui lo possiamo fare.
Ok, grazie, grazie mille. Direi che adesso ci possiamo prendere forse 5 minuti di pausa. Ci dispiace ho visto che ci sono delle domande, tuttavia non tutte sono proprio, diciamo, pertinenti su, ehm, per quanto riguarda gli argomenti che abbiamo affrontato nel panel, per cui ecco, se vedete che non rispondiamo è per questo e anche perché il tempo un po' è tiranno, quindi vogliamo dare appunto anche spazio all'ultimo panel della giornata. E grazie ancora a tutti i panelist di questa sessione, grazie per la vostra presenza e condivisioni e ci vediamo quindi direi a mezzogiorno e 25 così iniziamo l'ultimo panel.
Okay, and Beatrice also pasted the questions. So the first question is, so before answering this question, please introduce yourself. What are the differences in the way the research and autistic communities view the construct of autism?
Okay, am I first? Sorry, I have slightly poor eyesight and I have some trouble seeing the chat.
Yes, Heta, you're always first.
Okay, thanks. So I'm Heta Pukki. I'm currently the president of the European Council of Autistic People, which is an umbrella organization currently connecting 26 autistic people's organizations in 17 European countries. And I've been around in the autism advocacy circles for about 26 years in a variety of roles, both volunteer and professional. So the first question was about the differences between how research and autistic communities construct autism. And to some extent, I don't see this as just research versus autistic community, because these overlap and there are different ideas and attitudes in both. But to some extent, it's between kind of the medical interpretation and the broader kind of identity and cultural-based interpretation. So research communities tend to think and use terminology. It circles around disorder, condition, disturbance, deficit, on the idea of functioning and various levels of functioning. They seem to mostly construe autism something as primarily negative with some isolated positive characteristics and mixed in. They are more focused on person factors tied to the individual. They consider there to be core symptoms in the areas of social interaction and communication that largely define what this whole phenomenon is. And they feel that these core symptoms should be tackled with interventions, not medication or behavioral intervention. So if people are not keen to have these kinds of support, then they're seen as not needing or wanting support. Whereas autistic communities, for the most part, the ones that I mingle with, use terms like minority, divergence, disability is very much there, accepted and approved as part of this cognitive style, more focused on system factors, phenomena like discrimination and stigma. And we see autism more commonly as something largely positive or neutral with some challenges and negative characteristics attached. So we are very aware of mental health problems and co-occurring physical health conditions, highly aware of the multidimensional nature of autism through our interactions and learning within groups of autistic people. And I think this contrasts pretty strongly with something like the European Medicines Agency. It's a big player in the field, which encourages researchers to develop medications that target their core symptoms, saying we must somehow with medication fix the social interaction differences and the narrow interests and repetitive behaviors. Yeah, sorry, I do tend to lecture a bit.
I think I'm next. So my name is Eleonora. I'm a psycholinguist, which means I started off as a linguist and went on with a PhD in psychology and cognitive sciences. So I started off as a very pathology paradigm kind of a researcher. Got to self-identify as autistic and then later got diagnosed as autistic, and this changed my view a bit. And in this process, it was very important to me that I started doing science communication and met with several autistic people who made it very clear that they had differing views regarding what I was researching on. Specifically, I've done research on empathy, theory of mind, pragmatics, communication. So very central to, the way the autistic and neurotypical researcher views differ. I obviously agree with Heta that it's a bit simplistic to define these two views and communities as not overlapping, for instance. I myself am an example of this. But it's true that there are some differences overall. If we look at the communities, I think we should use the plural for both communities because there's different researcher communities and different autistic communities and autism communities, because obviously families and other people, other stakeholders of the autism world might differ in terms of views of autism as a construct. When I first read the question, it was like, do we have a couple of days to answer this one? But I think it really depends on what autistic and research communities we're referring to. I think it's worth noting that the idea of redefining autism from the inside exists and nourishes discourse on ways in which self-identification might be even more accurate than actual diagnostic processes. For anyone who's not the prototypical autistic person, who's white, male, heterosexual, cisgender boy. And I must say that in Italy, the debate is still falling a bit behind several English-speaking countries that I can follow. Asperger's is still widely used in some communities. People redefining autism sometimes insist it is not a pathology, it is not a disorder. Some even say it is not a disability, sometimes forgetting that, lower support needs autistic people might differ on this. However, almost none of these questions and reflections ever got to most autism researchers I've met in Italy. So it's not just about having different views inside each of these communities, but also that while the autistic communities started talking about these things in Italy as well, the research communities in Italy do not. So we probably do not agree inside these communities as well, but at least the autistic communities start talking about this, confronting each other on what autism really is and whether it is a disorder or not, for instance, or it is a disability or not, which I think is out of question. But the problem here is I haven't seen many researchers on autism in Italy asking themselves, first of all, what it really is, second of all, what the people we're doing research on instead of with think it is. So I think this is my contribution to this question.
Hello, I'm Pietro Cirrincione from Italy. I'm on the autism spectrum. I'm board member of Autism Europe and board member of European Disability Forum and in Italy Gruppo Asperger, and I'm captain of Romula Autistic Football Club. So if I understand, I comment about the construct of autism and only later about the language. I agree with the previous speakers. There is a deficit model for describing autism in research communities, but the community is very heterogeneous. both research community and autistic community. So you can have opposite streams in both. For my experience, early career researchers usually are more close to autistic community than senior researchers, or for example, psychology researchers are more close than researchers in medicine. But there are streams in the autistic community too. For example, self-advocates are different from usually from parents or caregivers, but there is the special case of parents on the autism spectrum themselves, but only if they are aware of their condition, because if you reject the autism diagnosis for yourself, it is not useful. This can create a conflict. So I comment about acceptable language later.
Nina. Hi everyone, so I'm Monique Botha. I'm based in Stirling in Scotland, and I'm an autistic psychologist. I also founded the Community Against Prejudice Towards Autistic People, which brings together researchers, autistic people, autistic researchers, and anyone basically who's interested in tackling prejudice towards autistic people in various settings. And I also helped to found the Striving to Transform Autism Research Together Scotland project, which is the Scotland's first participatory autism research network, specifically for identifying autistic people's priorities in Scotland for research, and then carrying out projects along that vein. I get to see both sides. I'm autistic. I know how I conceptualize autism, and I'm also surrounded by psychologists who are often non-autistic. And I completely agree with the other panelists around conversations of disorder, condition. You know, at its worst, you see conceptualizations of autism as an epidemic, reflecting, you know, an increase in rates of diagnoses. I'd like to add to that by saying that really it's about normality and abnormality. So, you know, the psychological science is built off of a premise in the last 100 years that there is, you know, a statistical normality. We plot people to the bell curve, and autistic people are said to be essentially abnormal, juxtaposed to non-autistic people existing at the extreme ends of that bell curve. And it's all about remediation to bring everyone back in line with essentially our idea of a normal person. So, for example, the first time I learned about autism in my degree, it was in a class called abnormal psychology. So essentially, autistic people by the wider field are treated as essentially not normal, some perversion of the developmental process. And that's really juxtaposed to the fact that when you spend a lot of time with autistic people, and if you're in a room full of autistic people, our developmental trajectories are usually actually quite normal to other autistic people. So I think thinking of people like Robert Chapman's work, it's also about the kind of political aspects of what constitutes normal and why normal is seen as preferable in society. And I think that that's something that can't kind of be escaped from in terms of how we conceptualize autistic people, because if we think of the therapies that autistic people are subjected to, it's usually in an attempt to make us more normal, because normal is socially preferable, instead of letting us live what we consider to be good autistic lives. And we might not be aiming for the same goals. And so those conceptualizations of normal versus abnormal also filter down into how we treat autistic people, what our goals are in autism research. And I think that there is a growing body of autistic people in things like psychology, trying to kind of break down some of those quite artificial conceptualizations of normality. But I think we're still pockets, and I think it's still against the grain of a very normality paradigm science.
Sorry, it's me. I'm lost with the question. So the second question is, what are the challenges in setting, what are the differences in language used to describe it? I think that a lot of you already answered, but if you want to add something to it while not repeating, thank you.
I pretty much covered what I had to say about that. I was having two first together.
Well, I'd probably like to add something about a term that some people used throughout these 2 days, which is neurodivergent, because I find it really interesting that, well, autistic people do use the term. They identify themselves as neurodivergent quite often, usually at least, people who are kind of politicized about their autism. But I've seen it used in clinical contexts and in research as well, as a way not to say autism, which is really interesting to me. And also, it's a political term that it doesn't really define autism only. It defines any difference from the norm. And since Monique said, I couldn't say it as well as they have, but the idea that we tend to pathologize anything that it is not normal kind of brings together people who diverge from the norm. So as a political movement, the movement for neurodiversity, which is neurodivergent-led, does not, it's not just home to autistic people. So in a way, I find it interesting that we're starting to use this word, which is heavily political, in a way that is actually a very polished way to say that autism is not a pathology, and just define which neurotypes are not pathological. Whilst what neurodivergent and the movement that we're referring to, almost any time we talk about the autistic community versus the research community, it's actually a movement that is much more radical than it's usually portrayed as. So since we're talking about other things that are not just autism, sometimes throughout these 2 days, and we refer to them as neurodivergencies, I just kind of used this space to remind that it's just not about autism. And this problem with pathologizing anything that is divergent from the norm is a huge problem that is radicalized in psychology. It's at its roots, and it's probably the reason why it's so difficult for us to have these kind of conversations. And I think everyone in psychology should read Botha's articles about it.
Okay, about language, it is very common, the medical model of disability, so the language is linked to illness and medicine and not linked to the social model, so the social dimension. There is, as you know, the identity first language. Autistic person is acceptable. And for person first language, there are two versions. One acceptable, person on the autism spectrum, and then the other, the classical one, person with autism, is not acceptable because it increases violence and stigma, but I let Monique Botha to explain because she is very expert. I wanted to comment that in Autism Europe, we have an acceptable language guideline since 2016 from the Congress in Scotland. It is translated into Italian too. I shared the link. And I'm very happy that nowadays several top medical journals on autism nowadays adopt an acceptable language guideline for authors in order to accept articles of scientific research. Even NICE, the National Institute in United Kingdom for Publishing Autism Guidelines, they adopt a guideline. Unfortunately, it is not the case for secondary journals or for dissemination articles or in common autism conferences. But I hope that we can spread, increase awareness that the language can modify the social context and awareness.
Heta raised her hands because she wanted to comment something that Pietro just said. If Monique, if you don't mind, Heta
Of course, go ahead.
Okay. From my perspective, it is not quite as clear cut as autistic is good with autism is not right, because I say the many different language contexts. And I think practically all of the Netherlands say met autism with autism without meaning anything negative with it. And we just did a little survey in Finland on what autistic people prefer, and we find the preferences are divided between 4 different terms. Not all of them translate easily. No, and it seems the young prefer something different from the older. No, and they're tending towards something that's like the same as autista in Italian or Spanish, but doesn't quite translate to English, does it? No one says autist. So there are language and cultural dependent differences. The core being, I think, whether there's some kind of construction that says you must distance autism from yourself because it's negative.
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic point, and one of the things that I was going to bring up when we talk about language. I think I'm going to give my answer in 2 parts, which is from the autistic community and from researchers. I think the important thing is about giving the autistic community agency and self-determination. So I sit on 3 different autism journals, editorial boards, and you see an increasing push towards putting out language guidelines. And I think language guidelines should always be about agency, self-determination, and respect. So is language humanizing? And have you actually asked people what they prefer? predominantly English-speaking countries tend to prefer autistic, which is identity first language, over person with autism. It seems to be the same in French-speaking contexts, including France and parts of Canada. But as Heta mentioned, in the Netherlands, it tends to be person with autism. Neither of those is technically wrong in those contexts. What it's about is whether researchers are willing to give people in those contexts agency and self-determination. So where we have predominantly English-speaking sets of participants or researchers who are based in the UK, or for example, the United States of America, when they start using person first language, I think it's important to drill down into why. So when I was educated, I was taught it's a person with autism, person with autism, person with autism. And I was sitting in class and I was like, but that doesn't really sit right with me as an autistic person, and here's why. I don't think it's up to us to say that every single community needs to adopt identity first language, but it is up to us to say every single community of autistic people needs to be heard and respected in terms of how they want to be talked about. And as we get more studies that tackle the social and cultural context of language, because language is political, it is social, then I think we'll have a broader understanding of, who has what preference, but ultimately it should be about respect. In autism research, I think there's a lack of willingness to use particularly humanizing language. So part of my research is understanding how autism researchers construct autistic people and how they do autism research. That's what my fellowship is based on. And in the first study that I did, I got 192 autism researchers from across the world to fill in a mixed method survey, including with open text responses. One of the most interesting things that came out of it was that there was a much higher proportion of researchers who themselves preferred using autistic instead of person with autism, and recognized that that was the autistic community's preferences, but in their work steadfastly used person with autism because the journals they were submitting to weren't letting them use identity first language, because it had been drilled into editors, into editorial standards, into peer reviewers, people who don't necessarily work with autistic people on a day-to-day basis, that person with autism was the most humanizing. Primarily because the people who work in those journals come from disorder traditions in which it is seen as preferable to separate the person from the disorder. And a lot of people said, because of the neurodiversity literature, they really wanted to change how they did research, but didn't feel like they could because they were essentially backed into a wall during the publication process. Peer reviewers would tell them, involving autistic people isn't relevant, using identity first language isn't relevant. So because fields are so siloed, it doesn't feel like there's necessarily a chance to kind of break that wall of disorder language, and everyone's trying to publish often as quickly as they can because it's seen as a metric for getting a job, keeping a job, getting promotion, and it fuels this really quick turnaround, really unthinking approach to doing autism research that affects how we then talk about autistic people. So I don't think it's only like what's happening in communities, but it's what's considered publishable and the hoops that people need to jump through to be able to publish. So I think we also need to tackle some of the things that are going wrong in research at a fundamental level to be able to tackle some of this dehumanizing language and some of the way that other researchers talk about autistic people, because those research communities are really set in their ways, and it'll take a lot more to challenge that.
Thank you. The next question, there are two questions connected. What are the challenges in setting research priorities that reflect the real needs of autistic people? How could they be addressed?
Okay, so shall I start again?
Yes, please. Let's keep the same order.
I see this as a matter of really huge, all-encompassing structures, financial interests, and systems for the allocation of research funding that have been built to be a certain way over very long periods of time. They have a lot of power and interests tied to them. And although we've been repeating the same messages for years and years, it doesn't seem to get through. I feel there's a lack of channels for conveying the views of the majority of autistic people in such a way that it would reach the key people, the key decision makers, who control the allocation of funding. And unfortunately, it boils down to this. Meanwhile, of course, there is already a lot of very good research going on that does consider the priorities of autistic people. These became clear to us, for example, when we connected in 2021, 22 to kind of discuss this between autistic people's organizations from different continents. We could recognize so much that was inspiring and interesting and aligned with what most of us wanted. And then at the same time, we saw that we didn't have the resources to continue that work. And that trying to set up the discussion, those in power and those representing the mainstream was desperately difficult. For me, I say the solution must lie somewhere in conscious creation of those channels, of building the paths from us to the people, the tables where the decisions are made. But I don't have any recipes for us. But I must say that our organizations still constantly struggle with capacity issues to do even the most basic work towards this. So we also need alliances.
So one of the problems that I see in answering this question is that needs of autistic people are varied, and they often do not coincide with research interests. We've seen it yesterday, and I'm sure Monique will add to that about their work. What I think I can add as a researcher focusing on things that are not really practical, or at least they're not researched on as if they were practical. So communication, empathy, theory of mind stuff. And talking with autistic people, participating in studies, especially when I turned to qualitative methods and, having the possibility to actually talk with them rather than, having them answer to predefined questions. I've noticed that even when interested in theory, let's say, so research on theoretical aspects of the way the autistic mind functions and the way non-autistic minds function in communication, for instance, they really would want it to be about them, not about them as compared to neurotypical people. So this is the main problem with, at least in psychological works, because our standardized tools are all based on this idea of comparison, of normalcy, of deficits and impairments to be found. And whenever we do not find deficits and impairments, we just talk about preserved abilities. There's not an idea of differences of, different and valid ways of functioning and communicating. In pragmatics, which is my field, so basically in communication, what happens is we have, for instance, cross-cultural pragmatics, where, two people talking to each other have possibly different cultural backgrounds, but even within the same culture, they have some socio-demographic aspects that define them and have an impact on the way they communicate, on the way they're able to understand one another. But it's usually seen as something where, both people speaking have the same value, basically, and there's no right or wrong. And whenever people do not understand each other, is mutual misunderstanding. Whilst when we do research on autistic people and on clinical populations in general, what happens is there's the normal way of communicating, the right way of communicating, and the wrong and impaired way of functioning and communicating. So we even have different, subfields. So cross-cultural pragmatics is a thing, and clinical pragmatics is completely another. So I've recently participated in a publication that I think will come up sometimes this year. It's curated by Milton. It's going to be very comprehensible. So for people who do not really read science, this is a reader. So it's a particular kind of publication that is meant to be comprehensible. And I'll talk about how some researchers have proposed to think about autism and autistic communication as a cultural problem. So as a cross-cultural difficulty in understanding each other rather than, a deficit. But I think for clinical work, it's very, very difficult to, use this perspective because it's rooted in comparison. It's rooted in, this idea of pathology that we've already discussed.
Okay. Choosing priorities is not only to choose the subject of the research, that is the intervention to test in the experimentation, but also the selection of outcomes. Outcomes are the parameters that you can measure before and after the intervention. You measure by a tool or a scale in order to decide if the intervention is good or bad, or it works or doesn't work. If you choose the wrong outcomes or not interesting outcomes, the research could be not interesting, although the intervention is interesting. For example, if there are some adverse or side effects for an intervention, but you ignore them because you don't measure them, you cannot conclude something useful. For example, it is the case in the past for ABA intervention. Very common to ignore depression, anxiety, side effects in outcomes. Other examples of priorities, if you choose as outcomes core characteristics, they are linked to identity too, so that there is an ethical issue. But it is not very common to choose mental health issues. For example, it is linked to quality of life. But the issue is not only the selection of outcomes, but also the definitions of outcomes. For example, for quality of life, you can think it is good in general, but not really, because there are many constructs of quality of life. The interesting one is all person quality of life, because it is covering all personal domains. It is usable also in case of intellectual disability. but in scientific research, it is very common to use health-related quality of life. It is limited only to medical domains and not usable for intellectual disability. It is very common linked to the medical model. A similar issue is if you measure adaptive behavior by a tool that is linked to the neurotypical model. A very common scale is Vineland, but there is a group studying this issue, for example, in IMS2 trials, AREPS group. Another example, if you choose problem behavior, which is a definition, it is not an ethical name, it is a common, also challenging behavior or disruptive behavior, but we instead should use names explaining the cause of the behavior. So distress behavior, for example, meltdown, shutdown, coping behaviors, stimming, soothing, self-harming behavior. So in the research, are you focusing on the person or on the point of view of the observers or the researchers? Because the observers are not able to manage the situation. They call it challenging behavior, problem behavior, but you need to consider the social context as a cause of stress of a problem. Another comment, even when you have a good participatory research process, you can still have issues if the researchers are the majority in the group. For example, for a democratic process, when the panel do not agree for a decision, you go to vote. But usually researchers are the majority and autistic representative are a minority. They always lose when voting. So a solution is to increase the participation in research in order to avoid the tokenism. A final comment, in case of intellectual disability, because you can involve autistic people with intellectual disability, but you need to give support for decision making. So you need to respect the preference principle in contrast to the best interest principle. So you don't need to replace the person, but to respect the preferences. Okay, thank you.
I think there's something that was kind of touched upon that also. So, sorry, let me go back a bit. I have like 5 trains of thought going through my head at any one given point, so it can be complicated when I try to speak. Every time in the last 2 years that I've had a paper under review in an autism journal, and I've accounted for intersectionality, so things like gender, race, other disability, I get told that the analyses aren't really important. So, for example, we did a priority setting exercise in Scotland, and while it was under review, we had done analyses to look at whether priorities would change according to the other identities that autistic people held, including sexuality, gender, additional disabilities, age, for example, which is a really big one. And naturally enough, autistic people aren't a homogenous group. So people's priorities were shaped by the other things that they really are in society. despite this, during peer review, we got told that, well, that's just common sense. Just put the analyses in the supplementary information. People don't really need to know that. And I was like, but people do really need to know that, because when you look at priority setting exercises, it tends to be the bulk of the group who have their voices heard, but not those increasingly marginalized intersections. So even in the priority setting exercises that do exist, when you come out with that nice, neat list of top 10 priorities or whatever it is, it tends to be weighted towards the demographics in the sample. And one of the worst things that I see autism research do is treat autistic people as so homogenous that our needs don't vary, or that our perspectives don't vary at all, which is also ironic because the heterogeneous nature of autism perplexes researchers out there, which is why we keep trying to think of different names, different levels, because we can't cope with the differences between autistic people. And I think it actually links back to dehumanization. So autistic people are so heterogeneous, but it must be because of like different types of autism, but also we're so homogenous that all of our priorities must be the same. And both of those things aren't true. We're heterogeneous because we're human, and humans differ from one another. And that's just an accepted fact until you start talking about autistic people. And second, our priorities do differ from one another because our experiences in society differ. And I don't think people are willing to put the time or effort into understanding people's priorities as more than just autistic people. For example, the priorities of aging autistic people, the priorities of LGBTQ plus autistic people, the priorities of Black autistic people or autistic people of color, the priorities of bilingual autistic people versus autistic people who aren't bilingual. So, for example, for years, there's been this received wisdom that if you have an autistic child, that you should raise them as monolingual, because if they're struggling with one language, they'll never manage two, right? Which strips autistic people often of complex identities, like national identities. And I think that's one of the problem is the whole autistic community isn't actually ever heard to be able to say, like, these are our priorities. And even when autistic people go out of our way, like to the ends of the earth, to make clear that we have certain priorities, we're not usually given a seat at the table in terms of priority priority setting exercises, sorry. Basically, artificial hurdles are put up at every point that they can be. And then additionally, in terms of funding that exists out there, most funders don't ask what I would consider a fundamental question, which is, does this meet the needs of the community you are talking about? So I peer review funding for a lot of different agencies, and whenever a funding application crosses my desk about autism, one of the first things that I look for is, have the team actually put any thought into whether this money is going on something that is important to autistic people. There is a finite amount of research funding out there. Competition is usually very, very stiff. It's hard to get funded. And yet you see multi-million grants going on things that have no meaningful translation for autistic people. And a lot of funders don't actually know that these aren't priorities. So it's not necessarily that they are malicious, and I mean, some of them might be, but a lot of the time as a reviewer, when you point out that, you know, the measures that are being used don't particularly work for autistic people, they don't capture what is important to autistic people, which means that the data isn't meaningful. And it's focusing on something that autistic people or cohorts of autistic people have really strong feelings against. Usually the funders are quite surprised. And this feeds into the other problem that I see, which is when students come into psychology degrees, they tend to come in to them with both humanistic and scientific goals. They want to make a difference. They want to learn how to do science. By the end of their degrees, you kind of almost see the split into two cohorts. You see the split into scientific, which tends to be thought of as like research psychology, and the split into humanistic, which tends to be clinical psychology. And researchers and clinicians reinforce this idea that scientific goals look like a particular thing, and humanistic goals are only for working clinically with people. Whereas I think science is a lot more complicated than that, and you can have humanistic goals and be a scientist. And actually, I think you can't separate them from each other. So when you belong to a minority group and you do science, chances are you do science to make lives better, particularly for the group that you belong to. So I know me, myself, I do autism research, I use a whole different variety of methods, but my goal is always, how will this make autistic people's lives better? And that is a humanistic goal, and that is part of science for me. But because people think of these two things as split, they don't think that they can do a piece of science with humans in mind specifically to make someone's life better, because they have this idea that that's not objective science. And as long as we keep splitting out humanistic goals from scientific ones, researchers won't ask themselves, is this actually meeting someone's needs? Is this changing the world for the better? And if we started asking ourselves things like that, suddenly being able to achieve the goals that autistic people want from science would be a whole lot easier, because they wouldn't be obscured. Yeah, that might be a really long rant.
So unfortunately, so it's 13:19. We're supposed to finish at 1:30. We have two questions that I would like to connect them, but also, I don't know, because I would like participants to be able to ask questions. So it depends, it's up to the panelists whether they're able to stay with us 10 minutes more, like to finish at 1:40. Could you raise your hand so that whether we move to the... Okay, thank you. So the last questions, that please answer to them together, because they're strictly connected. What might hinder communication between autism researchers, like consider them mostly neurotypical, and the autistic communities? And what concrete changes could be made to promote greater understanding and collaboration between these communities? If you could try to give concrete examples and of both.
Try to be concise, and also to comment on Monique, these ideas of heterogeneity and different priorities very much familiar, but I would also say there are some things that seem to be rather uniformly there. You know, study after study, in our survey that covered many countries, over 2,400 people, everybody says, let's have research into services that make our lives better. So then we can tell that, across all different kinds of autistic people, we have some agreement, but definitely also differences. So what might hinder communication, partly, I think, is not very different from what hinders our communication right now across language barriers, is it? No, we have different skills in communication, none of them necessarily good or bad. No, but there's a barrier. And it's there all the time. It doesn't go away just because we decide now we're going to sit down and talk about these research issues. It is still there constantly. There is the double empathy problem. There are people coming from very, very different experiences of life. Most autistic people, as far as we know, unemployed, poor, in a certain position in society, struggling. Most of the research world, not rich, but comfortable, respectable. We live in different realities. From my perspective, not being a researcher and not very closely in the research world, most autistic people consider research to be a teeny tiny part of their lives. It's somewhere in the margin. They're not very interested. Yeah. It's actually the minority of us who are here worrying about research. The research communities are used to fluent communication. They require fluent communication. They are competitive. Intelligence and speed are currency. They do not easily bend into suddenly investing a lot of the resource into communicating more slowly or in ways that will accommodate people with greater communication challenges. So the researcher who puts a lot of their resources into communication doesn't provide the kind of results that will give them the next funding. It's kind of self-sabotaging if they go into that. So it's part of those bigger structures that stop things from changing. Some of us on the spectrum have rather major communication impairments, or some tendency to become very easily stressed and fatigued when involved in the kind of work that this requires. And then there's, of course, the negative views. There's some researchers holding paternalistic attitudes, having that double empathy problem, including in the decision-making situations. And communication environments overall being created on the terms of the academic world. Okay, remind me of the last question. I can't see it right now.
Right. There you go. So the concrete changes that could be made to promote greater understanding and collaboration.
Concrete is very difficult to name. It does depend on negotiation, but I've been trying to advocate for the conscious building of communication environments, platforms, where there would be long-term ongoing interaction between the research world and the autistic communities, and particularly involving organizations of autistic people, so that the autistic person who's there would not be alone facing a powerful organization, but they would have the backing of their own community. And if that one person then becomes fatigued or is in an extremely difficult life situation, the organization could replace them. And we would kind of get past this natural selection process where the ones who end up talking to research organizations are kind of the strongest, most fluent, most communicative, and often the ones who most agree with the researcher. So I guess the only concrete suggestion I have is have organizations talking to organizations and picking representatives, rather than somehow going with this mythical idea of we will involve people with lived experience of every kind and picking individuals.
I fully agree with all Heta said. I'll try to answer them both at the same time, because I do think they're very linked, although I feel like there's no concrete change that can be made exclusively theoretical in a venue like this, because it has to be situated in the specific communities, specific studies, specific participants involved. What I can say is the need of autistic people to know the why behind everything they're asked to do is often not well addressed by researchers. Sometimes there are reasons, like scientific reasons for it, because they don't want to bias participants. However, they're already biased by not understanding. So I feel like the language they use, the materials they create, right now I'm not part of the researchers I'm talking about, but I'm sure I've done it in the past. I say they because I'm trying not to do it now, but I'm sure I've done it. It's often stereotyping, and it's not just about inclusive language, about identity first or person first language, though I do agree it's often very telling of the ideas behind the research, behind the way researchers frame autism and the questions that they're researching on. But the way materials are worded, the kind of questions asked, the way we ask to answer, some of these issues have been mentioned in the previous panel by autistic people participating in research. Scales, for instance, and it's not about removing scales altogether or just using qualitative methods, because one of the things that I hear the most being in a research community or in research communities doing more quantitative research is that like social considerations or this kind of things that we're talking right now, ethical considerations, participatory approaches, can only be done in qualitative research, but that's false. It's just we do not need to move all to qualitative methods, though I think it is evident that mixed methods studies are more informative, because we do not only know what people have answered, but why they have answered that, the way they understood the question and the reason behind their answers, though I know it's more work for people researching. We need to make the questions understandable and meaningful to the people participating to studies. I'm now talking as a researcher because I have had the privilege to learn this language, but this is part of the problem. So I'm now trying to answer to the other question. I'm a huge fan of science communication and of participatory research. I believe science has to be made accessible, and not just to be inclusive, but to permeate itself, to expose it to contagion from lived experience perspectives. They said it yesterday, like people doing actual participatory research said it yesterday beautifully. We would not have gotten the same answers without having involved autistic participants at different stages of the research. So wording the questions together, and not just, well, of course, choosing the objectives, and that's another whole part that I'm definitely not an expert on, but like wording the questions and making people know what the way we do science, why we do science in a specific way, and trying to make sense of the results together is really the only way to avoid hindering communication, because the thing that hinders communication the most is not communicating, and we're not communicating as much as we should.
I please, since it's 1:31, I please ask Pietro and Monique, although you might not be able to express all your thoughts, to keep it short so that we have an opportunity to read the questions. You have opportunity to say more things through answering the questions.
Okay, very short. In scientific research, we solve accessibility and accommodation. For example, if you participate in research, you need to participate in meetings, but usually meetings are not in simple language, but in such scientific technical language. It is a barrier. We need background documents in advance of the meeting in order to study, to understand, to participate in the meeting aware of the topic. We need to participate in training about the scientific topic in order to decide to have the power to understand. Or accommodation, for example, usually meetings are voice meetings, but sometimes we prefer to use a text instead of voice. The double empathy problem is a problem not only because the majority of researchers are neurotypicals, but because it is very common. There are some researchers, they study autism, but they never meet the autistic community. It is the case, for example, for genetics or neurosciences. They study genes, they study images, but they never meet the autistic community, or they study drugs, etc. Now they start to meet the autistic community because in order to get public funds of research, they need to be participatory research, but they are not used, they don't know. So we need training for researchers in order to learn autistic style of communication and how to collaborate. For example, we autistic community we learn how neurotypical people communicate, the social rules. Also, the research community needs to learn how to collaborate with autistic community. The final comment, autistic researchers can be a bridge between such communities, because they are both researchers, both lived experience in autism. They are not enough in order to make a participatory research, but they help a lot. They are a key of success in the communication.
My answer, I'll try to keep as short as possible, but it's about power sharing. And one of the things that really damages communication between autistic people and non-autistic researchers, and actually autistic researchers, is a lack of power sharing. So traditionally researchers hold all the control, even in things like participatory research when it's not done properly, and people who work as co-researchers who don't have positions in research or academia are given, basically aren't actually given any meaningful power. So I've been involved both as an autistic person in other people's research projects where I've been tokenized, and I also see other lay autistic people, so people who aren't traditionally involved in research from an academic standpoint, who are used as tokens to be like, oh, we involved autistic people, this is our group of autistic people, but they have no meaningful power. So an example of this was the original Spectrum 10K project in the UK coming out of Cambridge, where the researchers were like, oh, but we have a panel of autistic people that will meet once a year, and who had no meaningful input into the study design, and who had no meaningful input into the goals of the study. And then we saw what followed, which was a boycott, a big breakdown in communication between the team, the wider autistic community, and even the people who were involved in that study originally, the autistic people involved. I think if you want to improve communication and you want to build meaningful relationships between research and autistic communities need the power to veto. So in all of the projects that we've done with autistic people who aren't traditionally involved in autism research, the second that they hold up a closed fist, because we have a voting procedure, you know, this is a 5 on the scale, 4, 3, 2, 1. But as soon as they say, like, no, this is 0, the project's dead. Like, the questions that we're going to ask, gone. The research that we're going to do, gone. They hold essentially all of that power, and it forces you to really hear the people that you're working with. And I think, sadly, in a lot of cases, communication breaks down because the researcher can hear the autistic person who's like commenting on their work, but can choose to ignore it. So the power dynamics 9 times out of 10 aren't equal. And I think that creates a toxic dynamic. And it's really hard to break down some of those power imbalances, because when you are in academia, when you are a researcher, when people will listen to you because you have, you know, fancy degrees or letters after your name, it can be hard to distribute that power, but taking steps to distribute it, including giving co-researchers the power to just end a piece of research, means that you have to actively listen and actually engage with those people properly. And I think that goes a long way to improving communication and preventing some of that breakdown. So if you're working with autistic people, they should have the power to just essentially end the train of thought that researchers are going down. Yeah.
Thank you again. I hope that both the panelists and the audiences enjoyed the fact that we asked many panelists to join the panel. Of course, it's frustrating because the time given to each is not a lot, but we hope that we can build a collective knowledge and with different point of views and experiences. Are there questions? Who's keeping track of the questions?
From Maria Letizia Fiori. She is asking, in average, the subjects are male and white. Women are frequently identified as autistic when they are adults, and frequently they are interested in psychology. Is it possible that the Occidental language and culture have influenced this situation?
Well,
No. Yeah, not sure is on topic, but if any of the panelists wants to answer, please do.
Well, I think it partially is, but as a linguist, I have to say there's not such a thing as Occidental language. Like, there's many languages anywhere in the world, and I think this is happening anywhere in the world, although all of the research that we conduct is weird. Psychology is weird, meaning it's white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic places that conduct the most research. And usually we conduct it on people that are easy to contact. So that's another huge problem. And like all of these, of course, has an impact on autism research specifically as well. And all of the intersectional identities involved have an impact, including gender. But yeah, I think we do not know how culture can have an impact on this that much, because most of our Occidental cultures are similar in this. But Heta is probably going to say something way more intelligent than this.
I'm not quite sure this is relevant to the question, but at least in my view, personal view, is that the diagnostic criteria of autism are skewed, because of the history of defining autism, where Hans Asperger, for example, defined it as a typically male phenomenon, and his descriptions have influenced others. And I think this leads to underdiagnosis of girls, and then women, especially ones who are into kind of delving into these issues and finding out. They tend to discover and analyze and think, and then kind of go for the diagnosis later in life.
Okay, thank you. There are no more questions. Jassana is sharing his experience. She's from Pakistan, and she shared her experience, and you can read it in the chat.
Do any of the panelists, maybe this is a wrong question to ask. No, sorry. I want to say if you wanted to say something that you felt that you missed, but it's 1:43. So I hope that this is not going to be the last chance to interact and to engage. And with some of you, we already did in the past, and we hope also the new people that decided to take part in this workshop of all different levels, even the participants. I would like to say I'm sorry that we ended up making a webinar, but the numbers appeared so big for 160 people, but then in the end, yesterday we were 142, and today maybe around 100, because it would have allowed maybe more interaction, but we couldn't predict. Ok, quindi grazie a tutti e tutte, speriamo di poterci incontrare ancora per portare avanti insomma questi discorsi e progetti collegati a questo tipo di tematiche della ricerca partecipativa, dell'etica, dei diritti. Grazie. So thank you again very much. Bye bye.